I want to talk about New Mexico and childcare. In New Mexico, the cost of 2 children in childcare is about $18,000 a year. That's a lot less than a lot of other places, I will give you. The Build Back Better plan would limit out-of-pocket expenses for childcare to 7% of a family's income, and I know full well what that would mean for my constituents. But Mr. Amerneth, I want to ask you to tell me what it would mean, how that could impact the prime age employment rate, and also why that's important.
Yeah, so your question really helps to highlight an area where the U.S. has been lagging for such a long time relative to other advanced economies. So we talk about childcare being accessible and affordable. If we look at those countries that have actually made a real concerted effort to make sure that it's affordable and accessible, and if that means subsidizing the wages of workers in childcare to make that possible, employment rates are much higher. And as Dr. Stevenson also pointed out, prime age employment rate, which adjusts for aging. Yes, people are aging into their retirement ages, or they may be going to school if they're younger, but for that 25 to 54-year-old cohort, we're talking about employment rates that are, in the US, much lower than most other advanced economies. And we should really be asking why that is, and what's the constraint, and what led other countries to raise ahead. And a big part of that, I would argue, is female employment rates have been able to rise because not all work has to be done within the household, that you actually are able to have that flexibility, that childcare is not so punitively expensive on the market that you have to effectively be at home. And I said that if we can take a very stark example of this, even with north of the border, Canada's higher employment rates has continued to see higher employment rates, and in a province like Quebec, which is not really maybe known as much, but is 7% more than the U.S. That's a pretty substantial amount. If we're to say that 7% decline in the unemployment rate, if you could do something like this, I think we should at least pay closer attention to this issue.
Yeah, it seems like one of the things we all agree on, actually, which is surprising that we can all agree on something, is that we'd like to see more participation in the labor force. Dr. Stevenson, do work requirements actually get us to that goal? And what would the impact of a one-size-fits-all work requirement, say for the child tax credit, to be able to get that mean for grandparents who are the primary caregivers and who have custody of their grandchildren, which is a very common situation in the state of New Mexico?
So I think that it's not going to put people back in jobs. What it's going to do is remove cash from the household. When you remove cash from the household, you end up hurting kids, and you end up reducing labor force participation of those kids as they grow up. So you actually can end up ultimately having a negative effect by putting a work requirement on. I think that it's really important to think hard about how people choose when and where to work. We've heard a lot about how, a vaccine mandate may lead some people to leave a job because they don't want to get vaccinated. It's really important to focus on the number of people who are not in jobs right now because they are afraid of getting COVID and afraid of unvaccinated colleagues. I want to bring that up because you mentioned grandparents, and what we saw was a large decline in labor force participation among older workers, an increase in retirement. We're not going to be able to push these older workers who are fearful of getting sick and potentially dying from COVID back into the labor force by putting a work requirement on a child tax credit. What we can do is help households make ends meet so that they can then think about how to better participate in the labor force. One of the things we're seeing right now with all those quits is people are going into better jobs that I think they'll be able to stick in for longer. And that will ultimately also lead to higher labor force participation. So getting people not just into any old job, but into a job that pays a living wage that they feel valued in, that they can stick in, allows them to stay for 5 years like we've heard that people do when they're in a good job.
Mr. Chairman, in the interests of facilitating other members of the panel, I'm going to give the rest of my time back.